Hello, dear students. So let me recall you about the last session in which we kind of just had a resume about the international HRM. Now we have to keep in mind that now we are talking from the perspective of a global organization. If an organization is operating globally, then it has to adapt its HR practices with respect to culture, labor relations, economic, legal, and political system of that country. Now, how does that come into picture when you're thinking about an international human resource management? Now, think about an organization which is operating in more than one country. Now, in this case, as a part of the corporate culture, obviously, you cannot change the processes to such an extent that an organization operating in two different countries will have completely different processes. Although there might be some basic differences, but not completely. So let's take an example. If Microsoft is recruiting in France and if Microsoft is recruiting in United States, the process of recruitment may not necessarily change, but the type of recruitment contract will change because that is with respect to the legal system and the labor relations in the United States or in France. For example, in France, you have a fixed duration contract and indeterminate duration contract in which you cannot fire a worker. But that's not necessarily the case in US, in which you can fire the worker anytime. So you have to keep in mind that international HRM has two important dimensions. The first dimension is about synchronizing the best practices about how you want to hire and retain and promote managers. So there has to be some level of synchronization and similarities in the way you want to do that. But still keeping that in mind, you will have to adapt your HR practices with respect to the legal political environment in the country in which you're operating. So that's the main thing. And the third most important dimension is that when you look at a global organization, then you really have to keep in mind that what is your organizational strategy and what sort of talent you want to retain and what type of talent you want to hire, or in some cases you may even be firing an employees because an organization is operating in a dynamic environment which has implications whether it will be proving its strategy successful in certain environments or not. And that's the reason why you found that in many cases there are cutoffs in employee workforce because the strategy in some regards has failed. So this is how international HR is differing. That's the first aspect. The second aspect is if you are going to establish your organization in another country, then what type of outlook you want to have. So we discussed about different types of staffing as I already discussed in the class. There are three types of practices. Now take an example of a French company, any sort of company, take a Michelin, which is a tire making company. If Michelin goes to India and says, look, we want to set up a tire plant and we will send all the French employees there because we think that sending our own employees from the country where the company was found is the best way to understand that these employees are the best suited to go in the second country to India and start the practices. That sort of practice is known as ethnocentric practices, where the company where it was originally founded sends its employees to another country. That's ethnocentric practices. The second type of practice is polycentric practice, in which an organization will say, look, if we are going to establish our operations in another country, the best way is to hire employees from that country because they know the culture very well. So Michelin will say, look, we are from France, but we are setting up in India. So we would rather hire people from India because that's best way. And in this way, our resources would be not much spent according to the euro, but according to the rupees in which the local currency is. So that's polycentric practices. The third approach is geocentric practice, in which Michelin will say, look, for us, it doesn't matter if it is French, Indian, or in that case, even a German, as far as he or she has knowledge in setting up a power plant, setting up a tire plant, and has an experience in doing that in the Asian context. So in this way, when the company is hiring a global talent, it is using geocentric practices. Now, if you look at these three practices, you will realize that these practices depend upon the type of strategy you want to use, the type of resources you have. If you have more resources, you will definitely go for ethnocentric practices where you will send employees from Europe. If you really want, if you have a resource crunch and you want to make best out of it, you want to use polycentric practices. If you want to have the mix of both, then you would rather use geocentric practices. So it completely depends upon the type of resources, financial resources you have to spend on the HR aspect. Now, thus said, what matters is to us is when you are staffing for a global organization and when you're looking for international recruitment, there is a dimension of expatriation which comes into picture. Now, this is where the international human resources management starts differing from the classical human resources management, where the processes of recruitment, retention, and promotion would differ from the classical cases or the lectures which we have actually understood. So if you want to send your employee abroad, then there are lots of different dimensions which need to be considered. So first of all, think about your case. Now put yourself in the situation and you have an opportunity coming up and if you're working, in this case, let's assume for Michelin, you're earning around 5,000 euros per month. You have a good family life. You are very well settled. And then Michelin says, look, we are having this opportunity and we are looking out for people to send abroad to start up this process. Now, in this case, the selection process for you would be completely different because as you can see, an expat goes through different periods of cultural integration. So the honeymoon period, as you can see, is when an expat comes to a country and he finds everything beautiful. But suddenly in some weeks he's there in the culture shock. He or she is not able to make sense sort of what are the values and why things are happening in this or that way. I mean, I myself, for example, was kind of quite shocked when I first came to France. And for me, the shock was why people don't speak English, because somehow we were born, I mean, the way we were brought up in India, we kind of assumed that everyone spoke English outside, but that's not the case. But then after culture shock, there is this whole phase of readjustment and mastery in which you kind of try to understand the culture, you kind of adapt, and you eventually become functional and you are becoming independent. So you, I think, are also more or less in this scenario, especially international students, for example, who came to France. You've gone through this process. Now, considering this in mind, where an employee who is being sent abroad can go through these various stages, the selection criteria will be highly different. First of all, the selection criteria will kind of figure out that do you really want to send an expatriate abroad at an highly expense cost? You really want to hire an employee from that own country, or you want to hire any sort of employee who is working, who just figures out that the work needs to be done. So in this case, especially for expatriates, the selection and the candidate pool and the technical skills is quite different. Okay, as you can see in the graph, there are many different motivations for an employee to go abroad, and a lot is dependent upon how you perceive to build up your professional career, keeping in mind your professional and personal goals. So in this case, let's say if you want to go abroad, they will check, first of all, your background. Especially that's the case in US, where they will check what is your criminal background, or if you have done anything, something like that. Anyways, that differs with respect to legal systems. But they will also check your technical competencies and your cultural competencies, in which, for example, as you can see, what's your job knowledge and motivation? What is your extra-cultural openness? Are you an extrovert or an introvert? Do you have interest in foreign cultures? Are you competent in learning languages? What is your family situation? How are you able to relate with other people with respect to difference in cultures, and how flexible you are? These criteria may not necessarily be kept when you are applying for a position at a national level. Now, keeping this in mind, as you had seen the curve, it is important that if an organization is sending an employee abroad, they need to give them training. So that will include language training, cultural training, and what are the do's and don'ts, and obviously some hint about how things are done in that country. So a lot of technology is being used in this case about what kind of assistance you have. Now again, in this case, if an employee is working abroad, he or she may also require a specific assistance from the company which has sent him abroad. So here, types of assistance like online assistance, career services, cultural training, employee assistance can be used. Now, also another thing which also comes to mind is about how you want to appraise them, how you want to compensate them. Now, when you're thinking appraisal, you have to keep this thing in mind that that employee who is working abroad, first of all, he or she would be paid on the pay scale of the country to whom he belongs. So let's say if you are going there to India, and if you're earning 5,000 euros per month, you would still retain 5,000 euros per month as a base salary, along with the variable salary which you will be earning out there in India, along with the housing expenses, along with the transport expenses, along with the health insurance, and if you have kids, it would be their schooling expenses, everything which is kind of a bonus for you because you're sacrificing a part of your life and you're relocating abroad, which means it is also about your relocation expenses and as well as insurance as well. So in this way, you will see that the compensation becomes very much different. And apart from that, the company also has to ensure in case, this is where it gets really serious, is in case if there are any issues such as terrorism attacks, terrorist attacks, or in case if you want to come back, what needs to be done. Now here we are really talking some serious things, and I would like to give you two cases. One case is of Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is an international news channel based out there in Qatar. Their employees were arrested in Egypt. I think 2 or 3 reporters were arrested in Egypt for some sort of I think conspiracy case. But in fact, they were innocent, but they were sentenced to jail for 10 years. Now, in this case, what would you imagine Al Jazeera would have done? I mean, Al Jazeera even went to tell the US president so that he could influence the Egyptian relations to give them kind of a lenient judgment. But Al Jazeera at the same time took up this whole initiative at international level by asking them the freedom of press. And Al Jazeera even followed up by sponsoring the whole legal suit, which all the expenses went to have lawyers. It has also happened in some cases, for example, in some African countries where employees were abducted, especially this is the case in where oil rigs are there. Employees were abducted and quite a lot of ransom was asked from the companies. So companies have to keep in mind, while there is a good amount of positive aspect in which an employee is being selected, trained, compensated to stay abroad, these situations can happen in which unfortunate incidents like terrorist attacks or even some sort of cultural shocks in which maybe it's highly possible that if your wives and kids may not be able to adapt or you have some problems in the company, then you will have to come back, and that process is known as repatriation. So in repatriation, um, essentially, the company has to ensure that once you are relocating back, then what needs to be done? Now you have to remember, and this is very important, especially in case of expatriation, when you move out of your country, you leave everything and you move to new country. Now, once you are there, you have evolved in your experiences, in your position, and the way you look towards the world. Now, keeping this in mind, if there is any possibility that you want to repatriate, it is not necessarily that when you will move back, the company will have same position for you, because your expectations are higher. You have definitely earned more when you were an expat. So in repatriation, the company has to completely support employee and his family, first of all, to relocate back, give him or her proper job position, and ensure that his reintegration happens. So it's kind of reintegration in the reverse way. So that's it about international HR, and I would really advise you to to go ahead and look at for some articles. I think it's in a World Economic Forum about top expatriation destinations. And you will have some very interesting insights. Like, for example, Bahrain is noted as one of the top expatriate destinations. Why is it known as one of the top expat destinations? And you will see what are the factors which go into consideration. So I would really advise you to go and look out for international expat destinations and see why they are named as one of the best destinations. But most importantly for you, I think the takeaway from international HR and management is, first of all, that what does it take to become an international employee for you, for your individual purpose. The kind of technical skills, the kind of cultural openness which is required is completely different from the one which would be required at national level. At the same time, it could be also interesting to see that while you're working in a particular national context, you're also interacting with international dimension and international employees. So in parallel, you can actually develop your competencies, which will eventually prepare you for an international mission. That is your individual career path. But from the international perspective, an HR manager has to keep in mind that how the company is evolving, where it is expanding, and how it will set up its HR system, keeping in mind the political, economic, and the legal dimension. Now, as you may know, for example, in US, the situation is very different. And after President Trump changed the visa rules, the H-1B visa, which is basically a talent visa, the restrictions of that visa are becoming pretty strong, which means that companies may not be able to hire international employees as they were able to do that. Neither companies will be able to send to US some employees for temporary international assignments. Now, this is completely political in nature and which has come out for as a result of President Trump's policy. Now, whatever the policy may be, we are not here to criticize on that positively or negatively, but the issue is that the political influence on HR practices is huge. And I think this is where the international HR dimension completely enters a different phase, where you need to be aware about the global dimension, about the HR rules and implications in different countries, and keeping that in mind, how you want to scale up your organization's brand image as one of the best employers to work for. So that is for today's session, and I hope that you have it's kind of clear for you what I spoke about, ethnocentric practices, polycentric and geocentric practices, and how with respect to resources you want to choose either of them, what are the different stages of expatriation, and what are the unfortunate cases in which repatriation may happen. And yes, so that's it for the session. Apart from that, if you have any doubts, do not hesitate to ask me, and do prepare well for the exams. Feel free to send me an email if you have any doubts. Wish you good luck and have a great day ahead.